Today's episode of the Mind Sculptors podcast is sponsored by TCG Player, your source for all your trading card game needs. Use our link in the description the next time you get your cards to help support the show. Today's episode is also made possible by our Patreon subscribers. If you want to support the show directly, head over to patreon.com/the Mind Sculptors and you can become part of the Sculpty family today. Or if you don't want to do any of that, leave a like and comment on YouTube or a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts as an offering to Algorithm Jesus.
And welcome everybody to a brand new year, a new season of the Mind Sculptors podcast. I am your your main Sculptybois. I don't know that main sounds correct. I am Callahan, and joining me today is the one and only Jeff Propsfart69.
Hi everybody, Ian here. We all know how it is. I'm featuring my lovely Jeff Probst cutout that I got as a wonderful, wonderful Christmas present. It's a new year, same old shenanigans. I was actually caught off guard because we didn't do a cold open where we talk about some inane bullshit for a little bit, so that was fun. It's really throwing me. I'm not gonna lie, but anyways, yeah, Jeff and I are here, and we're excited for our other guest. That's not a cutout of Jeff Probst. We have the one and only Ryan from Playing with Power.
Who wishes he was a cutout of Jeff Probst.
You were a cutout.
Just saying. I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on. This is wonderful.
Now, do you wish you were a cutout because of like you would have less responsibilities as a cutout, or is it like is it just like a state of being you wish to achieve?
You dress for the job you want.
Oh, that's good.
Not the job you have. So.
Well, now I'm imagining you in like some very 2D clothing that's going to get a little problematic with events.
It's very, very depressing. Or like one of the things I'm thinking about right now is just I feel so bad for our audio only listeners. Mm-hmm. It really, anybody who's listening not on Spotify or YouTube is just really missing out on the full experience right now of seeing the one and only Jeff Probst stand ominously behind Ian right now, just silently staring off into the distance,
judging everyone here. Yeah, judging everyone.
Well, I don't know if you've ever watched Survivor, but Jeff is a sassy bitch.
That's funny.
That is very fair.
How are y'all Christmases? Did you have a good Christmas?
Oh yeah,
have a good time doing all that stuff. I am kind of blown away because today is, well, we're recording this not on the 1st, but it will come out on the 1st. So because we're in the past, but you're listening to this in the future, is today when this comes out is my 2-year wedding anniversary. Which is
congratulations.
Bizarre.
Yeah.
So that is pretty neat. So, of course, we're releasing a podcast on that anniversary. And that podcast is... So we have done historically with our good friend Ryan a annual tier list. One might call it the definitive cEDH tier list.
Mm-hmm.
And some of our fans would notice that we did not do a definitive tier list this year. And part of that is we started doing the monthly power rankings. So it kind of felt like it was like, doing the same thing with like a different spin slightly. So instead of doing a tier list, we are doing a full year power rankings. And so instead of just looking at the month and how the month looked, we're looking at all of 2023 from the beginning to the end. What did the meta look like? What do we think were the 10 best decks in the format overall? And, I'm pretty excited to do this. Now, going into this, it was pointed out to me by Ryan that we have historically not provided any criteria for what, constitutes a best deck. And I will say this, for me, it needs to be on, it needs to meet a certain threshold, which is make it onto the like meta report analysis that I do. And if it can't meet that threshold, then I don't know that it's one of the best decks in the format. That's my criteria.
And I want to be clear, like, because it can sound a little innocuous when you say it like that. It's not like a subjective analysis that Callahan does throw out there. It is like based on actual parameters as far as like performance, right? So these are not just like, oh, this is my list of decks that have done well. It is specifically a mathematically proven thing, right? That is not just innocuous, as I said.
Yeah, the meta analysis for a month to month is the events that it pulls from needs to have a minimum of 50 players, and the decks that, you know, show up need to have a minimum of 10 entries over the course of the month. Now, I amended that for the year stats, where I kept the 50 person minimum for the event entry. However, I did increase the entry minimum to 60. And the reason being is that if you count 10 across 12 months, you get 120, cut that in half, it's 60. I felt like that was a pretty reasonable floor.
Yeah, and also like 5 players playing a deck a month is like not crazy, right?
That's right, exactly. So it does a pretty good job of showing you. I've got 23 decks overall in that year deck stats. I will be releasing a full meta analysis breakdown for the year over on the Mind Sculptors website here. It'll probably be in the next week or so. I have not a honeymoon, but an anniversary that I need to celebrate, and then an event that Ian and I will be going to play in. So, I've got a couple of things lined up, but with all that being said, you can look forward to that stuff. And with that all, let's look at what we have for our power rankings this year. So starting it off, Ian, yes. We always do an honorable mention. Do you have an honorable mention for the year?
Yeah, so I'm going to throw these out there because it covers a large, I guess, like swath of topics, right? But the idea is I have 2 sort of like honorable mention categories, right? I feel like with reviewing an entire year, it's kind of hard to be like, yeah, one deck's an honorable mention, right? But for me, it's now, and this one might be more recent. This one's more of a December pick, but like 3-color commanders as like singular 3-color commanders are kind of on a rise right now. So, I mean, whether you want to take some of these as like memes or not, but I mean, like we saw a very good year from like Tyam pre-Bowmasters, talking about Rocco, talking about Corvold having a really good streak right now. We talk about Tivit, right? Like so there's a 3-color commander singular kind of uprising for this year. So good job for those pairs. And then I also had nondescript partner piles, right? So like this is, a pile of partners that does stuff that other archetypes are doing or in a similar vein, but then doesn't get represented enough individually to make its own thing, right? So like I think Tim the Malcolm is a great example of that, because that deck is like either very, very present in the monthly standings or like it completely disappears out the rank. But no one's in question that is a very viable partner combination, right? So I feel like that's a pretty iconic example of that. But, if we look at like the brand new Crom Rayham decks that are going around, or Crom Ikra even is a great example of that as well. So there's a lot of archetypes and things like that. And maybe earlier in the year, I would have had Crom Tevesh on there, but now this is a deck that has done well enough to isolate itself, right? So sort of a general grouping of decks that I think at least deserve a shout out if you're looking at like what decks to start building, start playing that you can expect to do well. But not have a specific avenue or lane in mind.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Kind of jumping off of that, I think my honorable mention for the year, I really only have one. I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but my honorable mention for the year is Malcolm Tana, which is a deck that a lot of people kind of fell out of favor of, but also had a surprisingly good 2023 for how people feel about it. It's got a 30% win rate. It has a tournament win, has a couple top 4s, a handful of top 16s. Nothing to write home about, but
I'd be interested to see how much of that is pre-June, right?
Yeah.
I think the Orcish Bowmasters put an arrow in the knee of that deck for sure.
Right. And that is very important context. But I do think it's interesting when you can look at a whole year and be like, oh, wow, I thought this was a deck that fell really far off. Mm-hmm. And, oh, it's actually doing okay.
Yeah.
Or did okay. So that is a deck that might have more legs than we give it credit for, given how it performed over the course of the year. Ryan, what is do you have an honorable mention for the year?
I only have one, and it's Talion the Kindly Lord. And the only reason that it's on here is because it comes so late in the game of the year. And I think that this commander does have legs, but it's still so new that we're still trying to figure out exactly what shell it belongs in. We're still trying to figure out exactly how good it is in the command zone versus the 99. And we just don't have the data to really put the numbers up like some of these other decks that have been around for years now. And so Talion the Kindly Lord doesn't make my top 10 simply just because it doesn't have the metrics to really back it up. But I think that this commander is going to go somewhere in 2024.
Yeah. Let's jump into this top 10 here. Ian, what is your number 10 for the year of 2023?
Yeah. Just before we jump into that, I do want to point out that I think, the last 2 points Ryan and I brought up sort of do add a lot of context to this, right? So you can imagine brand new commanders, quite powerful, that haven't had the impact that they could had they been around for an entire calendar year, right? And respectively the same about archetypes that gained new pieces or were punished and lost new pieces, right? Yeah. So like, who knows if next year, like let's use the Derevi deck I played, for example, right? If that version of Derevi becomes like a tournament like go to nowadays, right? Like we won't ever know because that happened at December 15th, I think is when I played that deck, or December 9th, right? So like I think there's a lot of stuff that can be like, yes, this is how we see. We're looking at the entire year as a whole, but like there's a lot of little pieces of context that can give a little more examples of like how that is done throughout the. But all that being said, my number 10 is Dargo Thrasios. We talked about this a little bit pre-show where it's a deck that keeps doing well that I cannot get behind. I really can't. It's a deck I have a lot of respect for the pilots who play it and a lot of the pilots who like main this deck and do well with it consistently. It is something to be said that like one of the main pilots of this archetype pretty succinctly has moved off of it and almost exclusively plays Blue Farm now, right? Referring to Freedom Waffle, right? And the deck as a whole is definitely punished by his lack of presence playing the deck. But
holding up the building all on his own.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. And I don't want to take it away from people like Manila Midget and stuff like that, who have also done pretty well with it. But like Evan did a lot of heavy lifting early in the year. Right. So like, I think it's kind of interesting to give a little bit of context there. It's a deck that I think I've lost to once. Right. So for me, that's like my tournament experience coloring that example. Right. Mm-hmm. If there's an archetype that I sit against and I look at it and I go, OK, I'm not worried about you for a while. And if I am worried about you, it's with X, Y, and Z context that I can pretty aggressively read ahead. Right. And that's how I feel when I play against that deck specifically. So. Yeah. On the other hand, right, we talk about the Thrasios engine. We have dockside combos. We have a lot of efficient creature combos that are really hard to interact with. We have the explosivity that Dargo provides, right? So like there's a lot of benefits of the deck, but despite it's doing well this year, I do have it ranked a little bit lower in this top 10 because I don't know. I just feel like there's a certain amount of oomph missing from the deck in general.
Yeah, no, I also have Dargo Thras at number 10. It is a deck that it made up just below 3% of the metagame in 2023, which is, pretty like on average, like it's about on rate for what a deck in the format looks like. Right. That isn't specifically Timnacrom. And, It really does kind of sit right here. It has about a 29% win percentage, won a tournament, got a handful of top 4s, a bunch of top 16s, a pretty decent like 25% like top 16 conversion percentage. So it's like, exactly as good as it needs to be, if that makes sense. I am curious to see if that continues into the next year. Because Freedom Waffle there for a while was the like Sisyphus of this deck, right? And I'm wondering if there is a replacement person who is going to step into that role. But also, if it's only one person winning on a deck, right? Like that is also a like red flag. And so I'm not saying it is a red flag for this deck.
It's a testament to the pilot more than the deck.
Exactly. Right. And this is a deck for what it's worth that had 95 entries on my data sheet. So like definitely was not one pilot playing this deck. Right. But it is something to keep in mind that if it drops off in 2023, it might just be because you don't have that same dedicated base playing the deck. And that might not mean that it's bad, but it definitely can indicate the like progression in where people are playing and what people are preferring to play. Ryan, what do you have here at number 10?
So mine is still Teamer, but it's Malcolm Tana. Okay. It's Teamer Pirates, basically. It's been doing a downhill slope ever since its heyday in 2022. But it's still out there. It's still it's fallen out of favor, sure, but like it's still fast, formidable. It's a consistent deck, but everyone knows how it works. So I think everyone just it's so choreographed now because we've seen it so many times is why it's fallen out of favor. Yeah. And, 10, people are like, oh, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 must be awful. No, we're talking about hundreds of decks here. 10's still pretty good. Sure, it's probably not going to make it next year unless something happens to it that totally catapults it up again. So it will probably not even be in the top 10 next year. But this is right on the edge for me. This is kind of right on the cusp between off the list and the bottom of the list.
I also think it's just one of those decks that has been built one way for quite some time.
I was about to say that.
And we saw that at the start of the year with I don't remember what he goes by online, but Vasher, there we go. Vasher brought it to Silicon Dynasty, and he completely revolutionized the way that people were playing Malcolm Tana, right? And forgive me if there's other pilots who worked on the list with him, but like to that point, it was the mid-range deck, right? Like it was doing its thing. Then Vasher brings this version that's playing Final Fortune, Last Chance, Warrior's Oath, Days, right? And Bring to Light and stuff like that. And the Kiki Corridor Monitor lines, right? Which were just like not being played at all in this archetype, right? People were like going top end with Niv Mizzet and whack shit like that, right? And so that's just like, so here we have the start of 2023 bringing its innovation to the archetype, right? Then people bring it more back towards the mid-range version. And once again, then Bowmasters comes in, One Ring comes in, which are both awful fucking cards for this archetype, right?
Yes, very.
and so that's what we see, right? We see these cards come in and sort of destabilize what's been a very consistent and powerful deck for a little bit. But I also just played against it in the top 16 of one of the most recent Chaos tournaments, right? So like it's not dead per se. It just might mean that, like with a number of different archetypes that I've talked about and coached people with this year, it just means that maybe it needs a boost from things that were just never thought necessary or pieces that were just sort of like, oh, well, why would we need to go out of the way to do this? And it's like, well, now we actually have answers to that question. Now it's like, oh yeah, well, we got to deal with this thing, or this thing, right?
Yeah, this stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum as much as we would love for it to be that way.
Exactly.
Every time a new deck comes out, every deck technically has a chance to be reevaluated and pivot to a different meta and to a different tournament and to a different circumstance. We're releasing sets every 5 seconds. So things can change.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's an amazing point, Ryan, right? I'm looking at it right now in Scryfall. There are 26,122 cards in Commander, right?
Yeah.
That are legal in Commander. 26,000. So
and how many were released this year?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the thing.
Right. So it's like the idea that we would have anything solved at this point is asinine.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Moving on up to number 9, Ian, what do you have here at number 9?
Yeah, number 9. We have Atraxa. So some people might be surprised to see it so low on my list. And it'll start to make sense when you hear the rest of my top 10, because you're like, oh yeah, that's a good deck. Oh yeah, that's a good deck. Oh yeah, that's a good deck, right? So this list is like, it's good because Atraxa has been doing well, right? To make number 9 in this cutoff is like actually pretty solid, right? we've talked a lot about this deck, and if you want to hear like our real strong opinions about Atraxa, I think go back to the month-end review when we have Wounded Satellite on, and we talk about the parasitic nature of that deck, how it works, like some of the intricacies of it. I use that as an example anytime I'm talking to an Atraxa pilot nowadays, because I feel like that is the most succinct way we've described that deck. Basically, like, you get put in this paradigm of like, oh, well, the Atraxa player doesn't have any interactions, so they need to help out the table. And it's like, okay, well, you got to let me resolve Atraxa. And we're like, well, no, because then the game shifts in your favor. Like, no, this works. So, I mean, but it puts people in that position, right? Winota used to do that too, right? Where it's like, okay, well, if you wipe my board, the Adnos player wins. And you're like, well, Winota's not killing me yet, right? Like, I guess I got to work with that. And that's sort of the dynamic that Atraxa sort of plays upon as well, right? Does that mean that sometimes Atraxa may have the potential to end up like Winota, where it's like, okay, once people figure out the riddle, they're like, okay, well, stop.
I think the difference here, though, is Atraxa has the color support to support a strategy like that.
Atraxa. Spoiler alert, it's not on my top 10 at all. It's not. It's just Atraxa has always been kind of a weird one for me because I somehow I get to be an old head sometimes in CEDH where I'm like why don't you just play X and X? And I always hated that as a new CEDH player. But Atraxa has kind of maybe come around the bend a little bit on that. I'm like, man, 7 mana cost commander. I'm not saying it's not great because it's great. It's a good, it puts up results. I'm not saying it's not a good deck or anything like that. It's just that, like you said, it's parasitic. It's like, well, if you want me to help, you're going to have me help by me winning. And I'm like, well, that's not what I wanted. And
I mean, I got to say though, 30% win rate for the year, right? Like it is a deck that I was, immediately very skeptical of, right? I was like, okay, bad food chain deck, whatever. Right.
Yeah,
but then
exactly.
Like,
food chain in 2023. What's going on here? Yeah.
My number 9 is Kenrith, the Returned King. Kenrith is a deck that also had a 30% win percentage over the year. Had 3 tournament wins, a handful of top 8s, and a pretty decent 26% top 16 percentage. So it did a pretty good job doing that. But overall, I think Kenrith is just it. I don't know that Kenrith will ever be better than number 5, in my opinion, because to me, Kenrith is one of those decks that it's just, how do I put this?
It's a soup deck.
It's soup.
It's soup.
It's soup that isn't like focused soup. You know what I mean? It's leftover soup is what it is. Here's what it is. You know how when you like make soups and like your parents are like, oh shit, I gotta figure out what to do with all the soup, and they like mix soups together. That's what Kenrith is. It's like
I've never heard of that. Who does that?
I guess you guys didn't grow up poor.
I did, but I wasn't mixing my SpaghettiOs with my Campbell's vegetable.
Wait a minute. You call SpaghettiOs soup? You psycho.
Here we go. There we go. I'm sorry, canned goods. Maybe that's how poor I was. We weren't affluent like you that could differentiate what our canned goods were every month. Sorry, Your Highness. That wasn't as good as it was.
If it go in bowl is soup.
Yeah, exactly. If can't be on plate, must be soup.
So for 2024, the question is cereal soup. That is the question.
Cereal. You can eat it dry or wet, but here we are,
But yeah, so Kenrith is kind of that just amalgamation of other decks.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have much of identity of its own. And I think it's kind of cursed to be that way because the commander is so generic. I will say, I think PTD has done a lot of good work with Kenrith. Like half of the good results of the year are PTDs with the King's Kitten list, right? And that doesn't look like other 5-color decks, I will argue. I think the way PTD has that one built, it's definitely way more mid-rangey and stuff like that. And I know like there's the Deadeye lines that are like specifically like, okay, this is Kenrith, right? All that being said, you're 100% right. It's a soup deck by all means. I also, in shifting a bunch of my decks around for this top 10, because I had to readjust my list right before the recording, I did have Kenrith up high on my list and then delete it and then forget to move it down. So I will say Kenrith probably deserves to be my like number 7 or 8, but I deleted it. So oops. Get fucked, PTD.
Kenrith is on my list too, but it's not number 9.
Well, what is your number 9, Ryan? What do you got?
My number 9 is what your number 10 was. It was Dargo Thrasios. We were off just by a little bit, but basically it's a lot of the same stuff you said. I don't know if we need to rehash it. It's for all the same reasons, like I get it. Like I thought was very apprehensive about Dargo ever being a viable commander till I saw it in action in 2022. Yeah. And
you kind of get spanked by Dargo once, and then you're like, okay, I get it. And then
it's not higher on my list because Dargo just doesn't explode out of nowhere. It requires a certain degree of setup. I need to resolve greater good and then be able to draw cards by reducing Dargo and doing this, that, and the other and stuff like that. There's a number of steps that have to happen in a certain given Dargo turn to really make something out of it. Once it happens, that's it. That's it. You're pretty much done. But you can see it coming because of all the things that have to get set up in order for it to accomplish this thing. But it goes infinite with a bunch of tools and stuff like that because of how Dargo works and draws cards through a lot of the sack spells and sack enchantments and stuff like that. And I guess I kind of like the idea of the backup if you're just beating somebody with a 7/5 is kind of cool, but it's still kind of all the rest of the stuff that you all said. It's, it's number 9. It's not as good as some other ones can be, and it has a couple of shortcomings.
Yeah. Moving on up to number 8, Ian. What do you have here at number 8?
Number 8, I have the Sphinx himself, Tivit. Were it to be earlier in the year, many folks would know that Cal and I were very high on Tivit.
Spoilers, I still am very high on Tivit.
Feeling for me on the deck is just that it is so good. And I have to add the but every time I talk about this deck, and that's the problem. It's got that clock problem, right? Where it's so amazing at this dominant mid game, and then you get to the point where you're like, okay, well now I'm going to resolve my Tivit, and then I'll hold up mana, and then people are like, force your Tivit, and you're like, are you sure you want to do that? Or they red blast it, or they hit it with something, or they're like, Tivit's been on the battlefield for a turn, I'm going to kill the Tivit by paying the ward cost. And everyone's like, now are you sure about that one? And then the person who resolves the next creature that is actually a game winning piece usually ends up winning the game, is what I find with the Tivit play pattern, right? And there are pilots who get away with resolving Tivits or having Tivits around for more than a turn and a half, right? But that feels fewer and farther in between. And I think for me personally, when I'm playing a deck like Tivit, I don't want to play Tivit and then people be like, oh God, Tivit's going to win the game. Because Tivit's a lot worse in those scenarios, right? Like it's the Winota problem again, right? Where it's like, if you think one Winota flip wins the game, you've vastly misunderstood how that deck works, right? It's an engine thing. And I think Tivit works that way too, right? You play your control pieces, you play your engines, you play Tivit, and then eventually after a turn or two of like getting in there, accruing some value, then you can turn the corner and go for the win, right? But when that evaluation gets a little bit off, then for me, it's a deck I feel comfortable playing less because of that scenario, right? And once again, like a lot of these are definitely colored to my specific experiences, but I played a lot of Tivit, right? Now I've been told that there are some people doing well with different variants of Tivit right now. I know like Temujin, for example, is a chaos player who continually shows up with Tivit, continually does well with it. Very frequent flyer on that archetype, right? But it really depends, right? So I like the idea of Tivit still continuing to be a good deck in the format. And once again, being number 8 on this list means it is doing well in the format, right? It's just, it is definitely starting to receive more focus than I think it maybe needs to. Not to the point where I'm like, this is ridiculous, right? But definitely like, the evaluation's, I think, a little bit off on the card. And when that happens, it becomes a lot harder to play.
Yeah, I think the big thing with Tivit that's important to remember is I think it is a deck that made an adjustment to a more mid-range game for when Bowmasters and stuff came down. And then when things picked up, didn't really adjust with that too. Yeah. And I think that is a big piece of that also. I think that adjusting the deck a little bit so that it's not so chunky is maybe worth the consideration. That being said, I'm not saying that the deck should stop being a control mid-range deck. I'm just saying, hey, maybe it should have maybe one or two other cards that help it turn the corner.
Yeah, agreed.
And that's really my biggest critique of it. And definitely, I've been doing a lot of theory crafting on Tivit lately. But my number 8 for the month is Tevish Crom, or for the year, excuse me, is Tevish Crom. Tevish Crom is a deck that, if you look at the numbers raw, is maybe the best deck in the format behind Tymna Crom. The issue is that when you then put your goggles on and you go and dig into the mud of the data, you see that it doesn't even have a quarter of the entries that Tymna Crom has. It doesn't have half the entries that Rog Sai has. So it just hasn't seen the same level of play that these other decks have had. With that being said, it's still proportionally one of, if not the best performing deck of the year. I mean, it does have the best win percentage of the year, like by a wide margin, like it by like 2 percentage points, which in cEDH is like a big jump, right? It is a 32% win percentage over Tymna Crom at 29, which is quite a lot. And it also has the best tournament winning percentage. It also has the best top 4 percentage. It also has the best top 16 conversion percentage of any deck for the year. Like, across all metrics, it probably is the best deck in the format, but it's really hard to say that definitively when it doesn't have nearly the metrics or nearly the data, like the vastness of the data is just not there. We can look at the sample that we have and go, this is really good. And if it continues this way, I can predict that it's probably going to be one of the best decks in the format by and large. However, the data is not there right now. I think where it sits at about 2.5% of the metagame, I think like number 8 is a pretty reasonable spot for it right now, especially when you consider that the other 7 decks on my list have at minimum double the entries. So like it's one of those things where I love the deck a lot. I think it's really good. I've definitely come around to it, but I want to see what 2023 has it. I want to see if it gets more popular. And I'm excited to see where it goes. Ryan, what is your number 8 for the year?
My number 8 is Tivit. It's just like Ian, basically the same thing. I think it is probably one of the better control decks in the format. I'm not sure if I would go in to say that it's the best one, because that's really tough to quantify with all the different entries and stuff like that. But as far as mid-range control does, I think that Tivit does a really great job at it. I think it does suffer kind of a Winota problem, though. Like, yeah, you have your Thoracle win that's baked in there and stuff, but you can't access it through your commander. The time sieve thing is nice, which is good. But it's like, if people catch on to Tivit and they kind of remove your Tivit, there goes your advantage engine right out the door. You know, like your card advantage engine through the clues and your mana advantage through the treasures. And now you're going to try and have to cast it for 8 if it gets countered off the stack. And now it's in a tough spot, because a lot of times you'll tap a Mana Vault or crack a Jeweled Lotus to get it out there. So now you're trying to have to play a control game, which is historically a losing game in Commander and cEDH. It just doesn't do very well. And I think this is one of the best at it, but still, you know, at the same time, it's still only number 8 on the list. Good deck, you know, still top 10 out of everything, but like, you know, just not quite up in the higher rankings as maybe certain people might have it at.
I see you looking at me. Okay?
Yeah, good. because I'm looking pretty intensely.
Listen, nobody is going to be surprised where I have Tivit.
When it's your number 1.
It's not my number 1.
Tier 0. Okay, that's cool. You made a new entry for it.
Nobody's going to be surprised that I think it's a top 5 deck. Spoiler. But it's, you know.
Yeah, Tivit's great, but like, you know, it's number 8 on the old list.
Yeah. Moving on up, number 7, Ian, what do you got?
Number 7, I have an Agila.
Okay.
So Najeela, obviously, a very strong deck in the format. I've often described Najeela as the peak and valley deck of cEDH, where there will be periods of times where, it is almost free to show up and play Najeela at a tournament, right? It's like you will either top 16 or win the whole thing with this deck, right? And then there are periods of time when people like catch on to the deck, right? Or there's a new card printed, I don't know, like the One Ringer or Orcish Bowmasters, hypothetically speaking, that sort of take a hit to that deck, right? And then suddenly you get punished for not having card advantage in the command zone and people are playing to the board, right? And yeah, you can see where I'm going with this, right? So it's there are some times where it is one of the best decks in the format. I think realistically in the front half of the year, Memo propped up the numbers for this deck quite a lot. Obviously, it's a deck Memo was very comfortable with, was playing a lot more tournaments than they are currently earlier in the year. And therefore, the deck got a pretty solid boost, right? And nowadays, Memo's kind of been off the deck and the deck's not really seeing as much play. Still puts up top results now and again, right? Still a deck that people should respect, right? Still a good 5-color option that turns on Guardianship as early as turn 1 sometimes, right? So like all of that stuff very real. At the same time, like you play Bowmasters on Najeela a couple times and then suddenly that part of the game plan is completely dead. Right. So now they can pivot to Turbo Nas, they can pivot to Breach, they can do all of the things that we know that the deck is capable of, but it doesn't mean that, there aren't certain things that can sort of attack that. Right. So Najeela, very solid list, but definitely is not without flaws.
Yeah. I also have Najeela at 7. It is a deck that I feel like by all accounts should be in the top 5. But is a deck that suffers greatly from the printing of Bowmasters, and it really didn't see it recover after Bowmasters got printed. I thought it would. It had a little bit of a resurgence in November, or not November, in October, and then November rolled around and December rolled around and December rolled around and it didn't even show up on the December stats. So like it's just like a deck that, like you said, has a lot of peaks and valleys. It's as Billy Joel would say, it goes to extremes. It's either too high or too low, and there's no in between. And if you know that song, I'm glad there are other Stormfront fans out there. But it is a very good deck. I think that it being 9% of the yearly metagame speaks to how good it is overall. But I also think noticing that it was 9% and then dropped off dramatically at the end of the year also speaks to how much of a hit Bowmasters was. That is why I have it at 7. Ryan, what do you have here at 7?
My number 7 is Kenrith.
Okay.
Kenrith, the Returned King. So a lot of what you all said before about Kenrith, one of the things I do definitely want to touch on is, while it is really good, 5-color bowl of soup or whatever we were calling it earlier.
I thought we were calling it SpaghettiOs, right?
Something. So, yeah. For all you connoisseurs out there, it's a soup. Yes, exactly. But it does. It suffers an identity problem. In some aspects, that's good, because when somebody flips over Kenrith, you have no idea necessarily what they're bringing unless they are the pilot of that deck, because you have things like Kenrith Stacks, Midrange, Storm, Druid, Reanimator, all these different types and stuff like that. And each of those have their own little subsets. You have kitten decks that are on Kenrith and stuff like that. And so I think there's a lot of advantages to having it, but it's just so generic in the command zone, as we said earlier, that it can sometimes suffer an identity problem of what is, I don't know, maybe what I would call the best version of the deck, because I just don't think there is. And because it can do anything. The higher cost, I know that we are in a Jewel Lotus world now, so that's not as bad. I don't harp on that as much, but you don't frequently see a turn 1 Kenrith. And if you do see a turn 1 Kenrith, you don't usually see the turn 1 Kenrith win the game. It's fine. It's a good deck. It can be built a lot of different ways, which I think is a pro of it. But like I said, it also suffers the identity problem, which is a con. So it's kind of that two sides of the same coin kind of deal. But yeah, Kenrith is my number 7.
It's hard to go wrong with 5-color soup.
It is.
Ian,
5-color bowl. 5-color bowl of goods.
Ian, what is your number 6?
Number 6, I have. Well, this might be one of the more controversial ones, but we've talked about this deck now a good amount on this channel. But I have Thrasios File Smasher on here.
Oh, okay.
It is starting to do well in the second half of the year. I think it is pretty clearly a deck that is picking up momentum. There are several top 16s with it now, and that's pretty impressive given the lack of pilots on it, right? So I think, let me see, where did I found it on here earlier when I was looking at the decks for the year.
Yeah, I was going to say it didn't even make my meta breakdown.
It did not make your cutoff for sure. So it's only been played.
It is in that 1% of decks that is just a soup of decks.
Yeah. So it's only been played 23 times for the year, right? But given the fact that it kind of wasn't even talked about, right? For the first half of the year, and now towards the tail end, it's getting talked about. It's sort of earned that title that, like, I think Ryan was sort of going for, right? And I wasn't using the original criteria that Cal was talking about for these archetypes. I'm looking at where I feel archetypes are right now as we look at for this year going into the next year, right? So I would feel very confident bringing a Thrasios File Smasher deck to a tournament. It doesn't have enough results that I'm comfortable throwing it up in the top echelons of like what is being played right now. But I would not be surprised to see into 2024 this deck starting to do quite well. And there's so many iterations, right? Like there's Curiosity variants on this deck. There are more explosive Isochron Scepter lines. There are Turbonaz decks. There are adjacent creature combo style decks, right? There's so many different ways that you can build this archetype. Like I literally was memeing the other day. I'm looking at a Dragonstorm version of this deck, right? Like you can do that because it can host a shell, right? So there's so many different ways that this partner combination can be built, and I think this sort of low to the ground lean, 2023 version of Canadian Cheese Rush, which shout out to the OGs who know that version, but it's the same deck that's just been iterated into the modern era, right? So.
Right. Yeah. Me, I love Thrust File. This is a deck I'm a big fan of right now. It did not make my top 10, but my number 6 is Atraxa Grand Unifier. Let me ask you, if I were to look at stats and tell you which deck you think had a 28% win percent, don't look at the stats. Which deck had a 28% win percentage and which one had a 29% win percentage between Atraxa and Rogsai? Which one do you think would have the better win percentage?
Probably Rogsai.
Yeah, well, it's Atraxa.
By 1 point.
By 1 point, sure. But like we said earlier, even 2 points is a big difference in cEDH.
It can be.
Point differences are substantial. The other thing that is important to note is it also, pound for pound, it had the identical top 16 for conversion percentage to Rogsai. Here's the big difference, though. Atraxa had a better top 4 in tournament winning conversion percentage, with a conversion percentage into top 4s of 7.5 compared to Rograx 2, and a 1% conversion percentage into the finals or winning the whole thing versus Atraxa had 13. Yeah, it was 1.3 as opposed to Rograx 0.5%. Okay, so
is this a pro Atraxa talk or
this is a pro Atraxa talk? Yeah,
silence talk.
Well, and I'm saying this mostly because of the fact that Atraxa is a lot of people will tell you like, oh, Rogsai is the best at getting into top 16s, but if you look at it, it's just as good as Atraxa. And the reason I'm drawing that comparison is most people would think, myself included, that Rogsai is a better deck than Atraxa. However, I'm using data here to draw a comparison that Atraxa is, once you get down into the nitty gritty of it, it is pound for pound just as good as Rogsai. And so for me, I put it right next to it. I'm on it. I'll spoil this for you. My number 5 is Rogsai. And to me, I have them there sharing that spot. Like they are right hand in hand. They are part of what I consider my mid-tier decks in these power rankings, because they are the decks that are not quite good enough to push themselves and pull away statistically from the rest of the field, but they are a good head and shoulders better than the rest of the average stuff that you see in the format. So I have Rogsai and Atraxa here kind of sharing this 5-6 spot because to me, they're both like hand in hand, just as good as each other. The big difference here is that Atraxa does little bit better. And again, like we're talking like half a percentage point, right? So it's not like substantially better, but when you consider that like the average top 4% conversion rate is like 5%, like half a percentage is huge, right? So that is one thing to keep in mind, is that Atraxa I have lower, mostly because I think it's a clunkier deck, but like if I had to choose a solid 6 and a 5, I'd probably put a Rograk over it. But when you look at the stats, Atraxa is better overall at converting like into tournament wins, like tournament wins.
So Cal is sort of infamous at this point in the Rogsai community for their takes on this commander. But the points being brought up are 100% correct, which is like Rogsai is a great. I mean, it took over the Winota spot of like, I'm gonna make top cut with this deck, right? Like it is that deck now, right? And given that it's very clear to see that like the deck has trouble when people are like, okay, the tournament's on the line, I'm not going to lose to the same gimmicks that I might lose to in the Swiss, right? Like I can afford the loss here if I go push my own game plan more proactively. And that's interesting to think about, right? And it also just might be that it has a bad matchup against the other good decks in the format, right? Like other top decks have an easier way to dismantle Rogsai. And I think that's pretty clear given the numbers, and if you look at the context of those decks a little bit. But that being said, you want to convert, you play Rogsai, right? Which is also why it is mine. Yeah,
because statistically they do just as well as each other.
It's interesting that the Atraxa variant, but also like I will point out, like Rogsai has a group of players who like know how to play it very well, and they do well with the deck consistently, right? We'll say Atraxa is very much the same, but spread out more so, right? Whereas like I think newer players can pick up Atraxa and still do pretty decently with it, right? But I think
a very skilled. Like has a high skill for it.
It is a very skill intensive list for sure. And I think that's pretty easy to argue. That being said, I also know many very good Rogsai pilots who still are failing to convert in the current metagame. So like that's something interesting to think about as well.
Yeah. And everybody's gonna say that I'm shitting on Rogsai. I just wanted to be clear. I have that at number 5. So like let's just
it's your redemption arc is what it is. You spend the whole year dogging on it and be like, all right, it's about halfway up. That's fine.
I mean, basically, I'm just being. This is the thing: is people don't like truth. People want to live in their little fantasy world.
Okay, here we go.
Where,
here we go, folks.
People like I'm really a conduit for the numbers.
I'm just a conduit of I am just impartial.
I am but a vessel in which to hear the word. Everyone,
I am just the interpreter of the facts. The facts don't care about your feelings, Rogsai players.
Feelings about Rogsai, I guess.
Well, that's enough for me on my number 6 and number 5. Ryan, what do you got at 6?
My number 6 is Sisay, Weatherlight Captain.
All right.
In 2022, this deck kind of hovered in the lower echelons and stuff like that. And people were on, like the Planeswalker kind of thing and the Planeswalker combos. And it did some stuff and it was cool and it was neat, but not a lot of people took it seriously.
Yeah.
And then people started to put up numbers with it and we started to be able to
took it seriously.
And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, this is actually not too bad after all. How about that? And then it started to evolve into hey, this isn't just a funny little planeswalker fetcher, this can also fetch creature combos too that are also really good. And it was getting that boost because more people, since it got that attention, started to see other brews formulate from it. And it doesn't suffer the identity problem like Kenrith does.
Right.
But whenever there's a Sisay activation on the stack, you don't always necessarily know what it's going to get. And that's usually when you kind of find out what line it's pivoted on. Is it on the planeswalker side or is it on the more creature side?
Just
is it a
don't let
hybrid
it
of
get
the
the
two?
activation, guys.
Yep.
Don't let it activate.
That's why it's also not higher on the list. It's kind of suffers, maybe not the Winota problem in the frame that you are all saying, but I've always coined it as the Winota problem, that if you have a scary commander, just kill the commander. A lot of times the deck struggles a lot. Sisay, I feel that kind of has this problem because if you just don't let Sisay resolve, all of a sudden there's these cards that are a lot harder to get onto the battlefield in the right sequencing in order to make it work. Kind of like a weird Hulk pile when you have two of the pieces in your hand. You're like, now what am I doing? Sisay suffers that problem a little bit. It's still a good deck, and I love that it's evolving because you can fetch any legendary. And God knows they're printing a lot of those, and so I really like Sisay a lot. It's number 6 on the list. It's just below the top 5, and I think that it still has a long way to go. I think there's still a lot of really good brewing space that can be done here because every single set release, we're getting dozens of legendaries, it seems.
Right.
And every one of those can be tutored up with Sisay, and Sisay is going to, grow and evolve with everything. And so I think 2024 is I'm not going to say it's going to be the year of Sisay, but I think we're going to see a lot of changes in this commander. So, yep, number 6 is where she falls.
I have a lot to say about this commander, but I'll save it for later.
Yeah. Ryan, since Ian and I have already got our number 5, what do you have here at number 5?
Tevesh Krom.
Tevesh
Krom is my number 5. I was an early adopter of this partner pair, actually, because I really didn't like Rogsai when it was first being played. This is back in like 2022 and stuff, to be fair. Yeah. So I piloted Rogsai because I needed a Grixis deck in my repertoire, and I hated Rogsai. I didn't like how it played. It was a little bit more fragile then, very, very all in, got interacted with once you're kind of out of the game. I know it's not that now, but back in early 2022 was when I was trying it. Picked up Tevesh Krom, and I was like, wow, this thing has such grind potential. And everyone's like, well, why don't you just play Tymna Krom, the classic blue farm? You get white cards and stuff like that. Be like, well, now you're going to be playing certain things that really need to lean into that can lean into the Tymna plan.
Right.
And so sometimes you're running creatures and you just don't have that problem with Tevesh Krom. You can go all in on Kitten and things like that. And you don't have to be like, well, I want to have some good attackers for Tymna, so I'm going to sacrifice, maybe a card slot here or there for that. And Tevesh Krom allows you to grind really, really well in a mid-range plan. I absolutely loved it. I basically picked it up when Kitten was spoiled and just saw its power because you have 2 inevitable pieces right in the command zone. They are more expensive, so it's obviously not Roger Silas, but the idea that I can get out the 5-mana Tevesh, have it protect itself and start drawing cards, or the 5-mana Krom and start drawing cards and be able to swing with them. Or if you're really grinding the game long, have the ability to Tevesh Ultimate, which is rare, but when it happens, the game's over. If
you've ever had a Tevesh Ultimate against you, you will never let it happen to you again, because it happens once and then you are scarred for life.
You're like, oh my God. Yeah. What happened? Like, this is insane.
I had someone I'm coaching who was like, oh yeah, I think I Ultimate Tevesh every game. And I was like, I've literally never done that.
Please tell me what playgroup you're in, because I want to play in the playgroup.
Yeah, I was like, every other pilot I've talked to has been like, no, I've never done that either. What meta are they playing?
It's rare. I've done it twice. It felt great, by the way. It felt so good. But it's like you were already winning that game anyway.
Yeah.
If you're ulting Tevesh, you're winning the game regardless. Yeah. I can see why it puts up the numbers, because a lot of people like 10 mana value in the command zone. That's not a real deck. Be like, well, let's see what happens. And they're like, oh, wow, just if you got your hand disrupted, didn't matter, because Tevesh and Krom there, all of a sudden you're in the game and you've got 6 cards in hand in a turn cycle and you're like, what happened? And just has that ability to grind so well. Playing it as a turbo deck, I think, was a lot of people's problem in the early days of it, or the early iterations of it. At least I thought so, because everyone was trying to play it turbo.
Ryan, it's Grixis.
It's Grixis, so you must play it turbo. And they're like, 10 mana value in the command zone. Maybe a mid-range plan might be better. And it thrives.
This is the thing that drives me nuts about that mentality in cEDH is that if you look at like other like Eternal formats, like I've been playing a lot of Timeless recently, right? Like Grixis is like the best de facto mid-range color pairing by like a wide margin, and it's oppressively good at what it does.
Yeah. And I think once people kind of got away from the idea that Grixis can only be turbo and really leaned hard into it with Tevesh Crom, it really bloomed. It really came to life.
Yeah.
I will say also, like, Grixis is in a 1v1 space has a lot more upsides at the control mid-range things, right? Think about your Thoughtseizes and your Delvers and like things like that. They're a lot more attractive in a 1v1 space, right?
Yes.
That being said, that's a little bit pedantry. This deck grinds super well. I think so. And then I believe my number 4 is next, right?
Correct.
Yes.
Great. So I'm talking about Tevesh Crom.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, so Cal did bring up a great point about the numbers earlier, breaking all that shit down. But like the numbers are really solid, right? And I
They're
think
the best numbers of any deck from the year, like by a mile.
And there's a giant asterisk next to it, right? Which is like most of these performances are by Sharky very early on, right? It has done very, very well with the deck. Plays it quite well, right? And then I picked up the deck and top 16 with it and won a tournament with it, right? And like that's my 2 entries with it, right? So obviously it boosts the numbers, right? But I will also say I picked up the archetype because of how well it did at the Mox Masters Invitational, right? Not the Open, I should say, right? It would like Tevesh like 3 slotted the top 16, and I was like, okay, this is like a real thing that's happening. And I was watching other people play it and doing quite well with it. Actually, one of my patrons as well was doing. I played against them at the redemption event at the first Atlanta event, the CCS Top Deck Series tournament, right? And I was like, oh, okay, like this is the deck just like played a bunch of value engines, did everything I want to do, and just drew a bunch of cards. And then I was like, okay, I win now. And I was like, well, I want to draw cards and win. That seems fun. So like, I don't know. It's just the deck has felt really, really solid. Obviously, like I'm very biased towards this archetype, right? I've done very well with it, and it's felt very strong when I played it. But the first tournament I took it to, I went. I mean, I had the best record of the Swiss, right? And then went and lost in top 16. And then the next one I won, right? So like, obviously I'm feeling very confident with the deck in general, right? It is very powerful, very explosive, very strong, and very consistent. And it has the thing that most good decks need right now, which is the ability to pivot, right? The ability to go, this is a slow game. I'm going to be in the slow game section of the game. And then, okay, I got to win now. Jam that Final Fortune into my defense grid and then go for the win on my next turn, right? And like the ability to have both of these things.
2024 is going to be the year of Ross yelling pivot, I feel like. Just, how do you win cEDH tournaments? Pivot!
Yeah, that's right. It's a great deck. I think a lot of people slept on Tevesh when it was first released. They're like, and then people are realizing its raw card draw power and the fact that it was a planeswalker and stuff like that. And I think that helped a lot.
Yeah, I think my biggest issue with Tevesh is just that I've had the really unique experience to see this card's like full life cycle, which was it not get talked about anybody when it was spoiled. We didn't even talk about it on our set review. And then
it was
Rebel
a 50 cent
did
rare.
a deck with it. And then people are like, oh, this is cool. And then Cobblepott did some stuff with it. And then more people did like some wacky shit with it. And then people got really high on it and then fell off of it. And then for a while, people were just kind of like, it's not that good. And then people kind of got really high on it there for a hot minute. And then people kind of came back down to earth again. And I feel like we have finally reached parity on the evaluation of this card, which is that it's pretty good. Like that's the evaluation of the card. It's pretty good. And I don't know that I think it is like, I think this deck has the potential to be the best deck in the format. Again, like I said earlier, it's very hard for me to call it that based on the numbers because like Because if I just look at the win percentage and the conversion, right, it's better than everything else. But then if I look at the entries, then it just like, oh, well, that changes everything, right? But it also speaks to the fact that it can have low numbers and also still have a high number of results, which not every deck can say. So that is, and the other thing is too, Ian, you're a great player, but not every deck that you pick up for the first time do you make a top 16 with. So it says a lot about a deck that multiple people can pick it up and immediately do really well with it. And I think that is part of why I think this has the biggest ceiling of any deck for this coming year. With that being said, my number 4 for the year is Sisay Weatherlight Captain. Sisay had a really big coming out party that was not at all small. Like Ian helped facilitate that in a definitely noticeable way, I feel like. And the thing about this deck is we talked about this earlier, where if you don't let it get the activation, then it's kind of crippled, but not in the same way that I think a deck like, like Winota is. Like we called it the Winota problem, but Sisay has the unique advantage of being in 5 colors, where it's like, okay, sure, that's fine. And it's also 3 mana. So it's like not that hard to get back out.
Yeah,
again.
you also don't need Sisay until you need Sisay.
Exactly.
That's the other thing, right? Like one of the best mistakes you can make as a Sisay pilot is just being like, okay, I'll play Sisay super early with no context. And people
Turn
are like,
one Sisay off a Jewel Lotus pass.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing about it, though, is it has a little bit of that Atraxa vibe to it, where people, how we were talking about earlier with Atraxa, where people would be like, yeah, I can help. It has a little bit of that parasitic nature where it's like, I can help. I just need this Atraxa hit. Where my experience with Sisay has been, the Sisay player would be, I can help, but you got to get rid of your op agent so that I can search. And that should immediately be your first red flag that they're about to win the game. Like,
I've literally never gotten away with that. But if there are Sisay pilots out there who've gotten away with that, good for you. Because that is the biggest line of actual dookie that I've ever heard.
Listen, I have explained my horror story of this deck to you multiple times on this show. If you haven't heard it, you can listen to this podcast. All I'm going to say is, if you're in fucking turns, you don't need to let the Sisay player go get a Sisay activation, especially when at the end of that turn, the game just ends in a draw. Anyway, but yeah, my number 4 deck for the year, Sisay Weatherlight Captain. Keep it up, Sisay pilots. You're doing great. You continue to have one of the better conversion rates across all 3 of my conversion metrics of any deck. So keep it up.
Also, one of the best Discords, I gotta say. It's such a wholesome Discord. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah,
like I love that Discord.
You can't say that about many Discords, but
I was about to say I tend to stay out of brew central Discords for that reason. They kind of become a little bit inbred.
Yes,
and they just they kind of fall over because of it. That's another conversation, though.
Ryan, what do you have for your number 4?
Rogsai is my number 4. Okay. What's been said that hasn't been said already. It's a really great turbo deck, and the Rogsai pilots have been evolving it over this last year. It is becoming a little bit more resilient. It can kind of, if and when it falls over, it can stand back up a lot easier than it used to. And I think that just came from a pivot in the lines. Even more so than just, a pivot in the cards. Just the idea of tutoring for heuristic study before you tutor for your ad nos allows you to get a much better metric. And just,
it's so funny. You said that, and my first instinct was to be like, well, no, I feel like the deck hasn't changed that much. But I'm thinking about the past 2.5 months, right? And like that's like, if you look at the greater context of the year, right, the deck has changed a lot, right? Like, I mean, even sort of this notion of like Bryant Cook being the person who is like pushing for a lot of these changes, and now it's kind of like, I feel like Zane is like responsible for a lot of the innovations happening with the archetype, because he's been the one doing the best with the deck on a consistent tournament level.
I mean, he's the only one who got a tournament win with it this year.
Yeah. And that's definitely like, I think Zane said something on Twitter a little while ago where he was like, I'm going to be mostly focusing on TO and casting. for a little while, and I was like, oh man, Rockseye's bad again.
Oh, Rockside dropped out of the top 25.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Which is obviously hyperbole to other good Rockside pilots out there, to be clear. But no, I mean it's a deck that's like had a lot of good stuff happen to it. As I said, I feel like the past couple months it's staled out a little bit, and I mean, Zay not playing it might be a little bit of a little something for that conversation. But I do think it's had some like big shifts in ideas and methodologies throughout the year, and I think it's hitting a bit of a plateau at the current moment. So I'm interested, as I mentioned kind of earlier, to like see what the next phase for this archetype is, because I don't think the same gimmick is working right now. I think,
the cat's out of the bag on all-in turbo, and everyone they'll just stop you. And but when you've pivoted to more of a mid-range plan, and they see a face-up tutor being not ad nause or something like that, they're like, oh, what's going on? And it has the ability to fight a lot better at the tables, because they know that everyone targets the Rockside player, so they had to pivot their strategies, and it's doing very well as a result. Maybe not in the overall conversions like you said, Cal, but
I mean,
a lot of pilots are on
top 16s like almost better than any other deck.
Exactly.
The difference is, and I think Ian did a really good job of like encapsulating this, is I think where Rogside struggles is that Rogside doesn't get away with as much when you get into these winner take all scenarios, because your opponent like quality just skyrockets. So you don't get to get away with one player at the table being a complete numbskull as much. So
sending their op agent to a Sisay activation in turns, for example.
I swear to God, I want to do it. I thought it was going to jump through my computer screen. Ian, what do you have here at number 3?
Ooh, in the top 3 now. Now it's all big now.
I'm gonna get farther away so I can yell this one. 2023 was the year of Sisay. Okay, now I'm back. All right. So Sisay is my number 3. It's if you've been watching these breakdowns throughout 2023, you know what my number 2 and number 1 are probably going to be. But let's talk about Sisay, right? Because I often keep it around the 5, the 4, the 6 of this breakdown, all these things, right? But my God, do people keep surprising me with what they can do with Sisay, right? Like we just had a tournament that had a Sisay Underworld Breach package that wasn't even using LED, but it was using like...
That was such a cool deck. When I saw you, when I was editing that video, I was like, that's fucking cool.
Yeah, and then the innovation of like 5 mana Flash Teferi is like... That's something that's lived rent-free in my head since I saw that the other day. And there's all of these things that people are doing right now with this archetype that are just pushing boundaries. And because of the way the nature of that deck works, because it just needs legendaries, because they print cards like Kutsil that completely give the deck the biggest boost and injection it's ever gotten, right? They keep doing this stuff. So why wouldn't Sisay pilots keep getting rewarded for it, right?
Yep.
The deck is meant to continually be getting these benefits. Like I literally was in a coaching session with somebody who made a Zerda version of Sisay that was all about going and getting Agatha's Soul Cauldron and using a ton of colorless mana to be more explosive than the average Sisay deck, right? And it was ridiculous, but it worked. And like that was just an extreme example of something you can do with this deck, right? And
it's a Rube Goldberg machine deck.
Right. But if something like that is possible, then like that is explaining so much about how powerful this commander is.
Right.
But the last Mox Masters, 4 of the top 16 were Sisay decks, including the winning deck.
I was about to say 2 of the top 4 were Sisay decks.
Yeah.
Literally half the top 4.
Yeah. And I mean, so like, yes, Cal mentioned, I definitely think there was a popularization of the deck that happened because of my deep run with it at the Chaos tournament, right? So I think it was, I mean,
you put Malcolm, a lot of eyes on it.
I put eyes on it, right? Like I will not claim to be an innovator of Sisay, right? I owe a lot to Mike from the Howling Salt Mine, who I borrowed his Sisay list and said, hey, it feels like the Planeswalker lines would be cleaner in this deck than anything you're doing in here. And he'd be like, yeah, I guess probably, And I was like, I showed him like 3 or 4 times when I brought his deck. I was like, I think I would have won if you had the Planeswalkers in here. And then I did that like another 2 times in a row. And he was like, okay, I'll put him in. Fine. But then that got me itching to like look at this deck. Malcolm was already a player I respected a lot who had been like repping Sisay for a long time. And I was like, wow, Malcolm's been actually like putting in like this deck starts to look way more real than it's ever done before, right? So the combination of the 2 of them, Malcolm making these deep runs with the deck when no one had been doing it for a while, combined with, picking up this theme of like having seen it in a local scene, I was like, okay, like let's pick this deck up. I played it, top forward with the first tournament I played it at, right? It felt very solid, especially when people didn't know the lines, right? So that was a tournament where I was able to take advantage of a lack of information about the archetype, right? And then I, did very well with it in my local scene. I like went undefeated on a day where I just like, it was like a play for a dual land kind of thing. It's like every single thing you played for like a certain amount of store credit, right? And I played and I won and I won and I won and I won. And I was like, oh my God, this deck's crazy, right? And then suddenly it was everybody's on Sisay, right? And everyone's bringing it, everyone's showing up, everyone's representing it. But you can play it in so many diverse and different ways. Like I've done so many coaching sessions on this deck lately. And I'm like, oh, okay, this person's playing the heavy 4-drop variant. This person's playing the 1-ring variant. Like this person's playing crazy shit like Breach, right? Like it's not a deck that's limited. And it went from, and we talked about this as far like the context of the course of the year, right? Like this deck just picked up right before Lord of the Rings. So it missed the first half of the year as far as results, except for Malcolm's like 1 Punt City 2 result, right? It was completely off the radar. And then suddenly it's showing up a ton. And now we're ending the year with this Mox Masters overrepresentation of, once again, a quarter of the top 16, half of the top 4, and winning the tournament. Yeah. So I think this is just like been a clear culmination of Sisay just picking up this momentum, rolling downhill, just like picking up more and more wins as the year goes on. And the deck still has so much more it can do. And as Ryan mentioned, like Commander's taken up a design philosophy in Wizards printing nowadays, right? So there's not going to be a lack of legendary permanents that are coming out, right? We, adding cards from Doctor Who and Ixalan and like all of these things.
486 printed this year, legendaries that can be fetchable with Sisay. Next year's going to be the same thing.
1,000 legends.
Exactly. We're talking nearly 500 cards that were tools that Sisay could technically use. Next year's going to be the same. We know it is. Yeah. So it's only going to get better every single year.
Completely agree. So that's my tirade on Sisay. I said I had a lot to say later, and there it is.
There it is, everyone.
Well, moving on up to my number 3 pick for the year is this is where I put Tim Necrom. No, it's this is where I have Tivit, Seller of Secrets. To the shock and awe of nobody.
Exactly 2 people.
Yeah.
Not here, not on this call.
Yeah.
People out there.
Tivit performed exceptionally well this year overall. Backslid a little bit towards the end of the year, but I think that was less of an issue with the like commander and more of just a need to maybe adapt the gameplay in a little bit, like I said earlier, to be a little bit less chunky, be able to turn the corner a little bit better in this faster metagame where the round limits just keep going down. So need to adjust just a little bit, but overall, like the deck is still like, even as recently as like November and in December, it has top results. So like it's still doing well. And it is a deck that overall I feel confident in. This is also, now we're kind of in the range of the decks that make up like 9+% of the metagame. So, this is a deck that a lot of people are on and we're on, and I think just continues to have like a pretty decent win percentage. It's not the best, but 27% isn't bad. So has a really reasonable conversion percentage at 23%, and it does a lot better of converting once it's in the top 16 than a lot of other decks. So that is one advantage to the list. But overall, big fan of Tivit. If you were not aware of that already, welcome to the Mind Sculptors. My name is Callahan. And,
please hit that subscribe button.
Yeah, hit the like and subscribe button.
This is obviously your first time here.
Thank you for checking out the podcast. But yeah, I'm a big fan. Tivit's been in my top 5 for a while. So I don't see that changing anytime soon unless all of the sudden it just becomes straight up unplayable, and I don't know that is going to happen. So with that being said, Ryan, what do you have here at number 3?
My number 3 is Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy.
Okay.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Oh gosh, what can I say about this deck? Basically, this has got to be one of the most casual to cEDH converting decks I've seen in the history that I've been playing cEDH. You know, when you talk to the casual commander crowds trying to get them into cEDH, people are talking about combos and they're talking about partner pairs and they're talking about all this stuff. And they're like, it sounds like, I don't know if that's my vibe. Yeah. And then all of a sudden you talk about Kinnan and you're like, hey, do you like to ramp? Do I ever?
Hey, do you like big, stupid creatures?
Hey, do you like really big, stupid creatures that win the game? Hey, yeah. I do like that. Be like, do I have a deck for you that actually puts up really good numbers?
Yeah.
And Kinnan is the one. And the thing is that what I love about Kinnan is not only just that, but it has 2 other things. One, it is newbie friendly, but has a really good high skill ceiling. So it grows as you grow as a cEDH player.
Yeah.
So you feel like you're leveling up and the deck is leveling up with you versus some other decks that are a little bit maybe more newbie friendly, but their ceiling isn't as high and you feel like you outgrow it. So there's a big plateau there and you don't always know why. Whereas Kinnan allows you to have that growth. And number 2, it is one of the most pet card friendly decks I've ever seen. Oh man, I've always loved this big stupid whatever, and be like, you can put it in there if you want. I'm not going to say that it's always going to single-handedly win you the game.
Chimera really as a pet card when you really boil it down.
Exactly. Perplexing Chimera, or just Terrastodon.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing up Perplexing Chimera. I was going to be quiet for the Kinnan section and talk about Kinnan later, but my God, the Perplexing Chimera is a blight on our society. And I think if I have to teach a new player and ask them politely to cut it if they don't know how to play it one more time.
Yes. But that's what I love about Kinnan, and it just puts up good numbers. I mean, so that on top of the fact that it has all these different really good access points to the format, which is what I love. And just like how we talked about legendaries were printed, 317 new non-humans were printed this year. So
the other thing is though, it doesn't even matter that because it just makes so much goddamn mana. Who cares? Right? Like
exactly.
It doesn't matter. Like you could put it like a fucking Dodge Ram in that. It would do just as well.
Exactly. And so non-humans, there were 317 printed this year. I'm not saying every one of them going to Kinnan, but so that means that this deck is never going to kind of is going to get too stagnant because there's always going to be the Timmy cards that get released that could see really good play in Kinnan. That's why I think Kinnan is fantastic. So top 3 for me.
Super valid points.
Hey, also Ian, another very good card come out this year for the archetype, but we can talk about that when we talk about
Ian, I think it's pretty safe to say you and I have the same number 2 and number 1.
Do we? Maybe.
What's your number 2?
No. My number 2 is Blue Farm.
It's Tymna Kraum. Okay. Yeah. Why do you have Tymna Kraum here?
Because Tymna Kraum is arguably the best deck in the format, but Kinnan's better. We'll talk about that later. But Blue Farm is obviously insane. Like it's obviously a very good deck, right? Whereas Tevesh Kraum, I could see like maybe needing a little bit of work, meaning being one less color, all of that stuff. Tymna Kraum is definitive for our format, right? It is a very strong archetype. It is hard to argue with, and it was doing fine until 2023 happened, and you have a fun little set called Lord of the Rings, and suddenly it's the best deck in the format. I think Lord of the Rings was the best thing to happen to this deck. I think it took it from an A tier deck to a deck that I would argue is not the best deck in the format, to a deck I will happily argue is the best or one of the top 2 best decks in the format. Bowmasters, we all thought it would hit Tymna. What it did was it murdered anything that competed with Tymna in the freaking format. Yep. Anything that was an inconvenience for Blue Farm got sniped out of this format and left this big open fucking space for Blue Farm to just do whatever it wanted. Yeah. It's absolutely insane. They were like, hey, remember how we have these cards like Notion Thief and stuff like that that'll punish you for sitting behind a Crom? Well, guess what? they're out of here. Blue Farm, do whatever the fuck you want. Yep. Nobody else matters. Blue Farm, you have a great time, buddy. You go do whatever you want. You got 4 colors in there, great. You want Breach? Sure. You got
buddy,
Thoracle,
and if you want to play that Notion Thief, go for it, baby. Who cares? You got an Orcish Bowmasters yourself. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh my God. That's the other thing is like the one card that like stops the deck is Bowmasters. But you know what Blue Farm's really good at playing? Fucking Bowmasters.
Yeah. You know what stops Bowmasters?
Bowmasters.
Another
That's
Bowmasters.
kind of the issue with that card, right? I think we've talked about that before. It's like the issue with Bowmasters is the best answer for Bowmasters is another Bowmasters.
Yes. Yeah. But it's, I don't know. Blue Farm is just so uninhibited. The play patterns that the deck already was thriving with then became definitive for the format. Right? Hiding behind your Ristic, hiding behind your Crom, hiding behind your Smothering Tithe. Those are all things you can do in Blue Farm, and it's stuff that is so good with this deck, right? And it's like, okay, I talked about Pivot earlier. Great. You know what you have in the deck that allows you to quickly transition from defending to winning? Uncounterable Grand Abolishers, Ranger Captain of Eos, Final Fortune, like all of these cards that are so good in this archetype, right? Or Teferi, 3 mana Teferi. I talked about that being one of the best cards in the archetype, right? And then if you go to cast your Grand Abolisher and it gets countered, you go, oh no, I guess I'll have to, I don't know, go to combat and draw some cards.
You said that wrong, Ian. You said that wrong. It's Crombat.
Oh,
yeah,
so sorry.
That's right.
But then you get all the cards you just wasted and you're like, wow, that was a really solid win attempt. The next person, you should go for it. So by the time that it gets back to me, everyone's used the interaction and I've refilled because I have a Crom. It's just like, what? Oh my God. Anyways, this is the year end. I feel like I could be the most dramatic version in describing how this deck just got the biggest booster shot this year. It's insane. Like Rule of Laws were murdered by Bowmasters in One Ring and stuff like that. And Tim McCrom was just like, oh well, if you wanna kill all the things that are stopping me, I will never stop you from doing that. You guys just go on right ahead.
You guys ridiculous. Have a good time.
Yeah, have a good time, everybody. I'll be over here drawing cards with Crom. Oh, do you mind if I just sneak this Grand Abolisher in? Is that okay, everyone?
Tim McCrom, very good. My number 2 is Kinnan Bonder Prodigy. A lot of what you said, Ryan, I think is true. I think when you look at the stats, it is the definitive number 2 deck. It is, I don't know how much else to say about it. It is missing 1 tournament win on my stats just because of the fact that, Monarch didn't get into the this list because it wasn't on what's it called, top 16. Yeah. But it's pretty easy to look at this and look at the deck and go, oh hey, wow, this has one of the best top 16 conversion rates. Oh, this has one of the best top 4 conversion rates. Oh, would you look at that? It has one of the best top or tournament winning conversion rates. And it's very consistent. I think the biggest pit of the deck is that because it is played by a lot of new players, it eats into its overall win percentage. And so its overall win percentage looks a lot worse than what the deck's like actual quality is. So like it's sporting a 26% win percentage, which is like noticeably worse than a lot of the other like decks around it up in this area. The big but that is the contextual thing. We talked about this with Tim McCrom before, right? Where there was a period of time where Tim McCrom was really struggling because a lot of new players were playing it and they weren't playing it right. And it was doing all this stuff wrong. Kinnan has that, but then it just still fucking converts. So like, does it really matter for this deck? So it's one of those things where I think it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, but it also has like half the games played on the year that Tim McCrom has, which is bananas considering that it had like 1,500 games played in the year. So
I will also say, I want to throw it out there that like, not only is like all of those like stats are really super important for this deck, right? But like if we look at Wounded Satellite, who is like obviously the most consistent Kinnan player of the year, right? Like Kinnan is my top deck of the year and I have a ton of results with it, right? But like Wounded is obviously here every tournament playing the same deck, doing quite well with it, right? He's also gone on record this year and saying, wow, it's amazing how much my draws hurt my win percentage, right? And because he was one of the people this year pushing for what I've been calling draw gate, right? Which is, that period of time where everyone was hitting that 2 wins early on and then just drawing out so they could just lock the top 16 slot, right? Now, a lot more players are resistant to that, I've noticed lately. A lot more players are playing it out. A lot more players are fighting over the top 16 slots. A lot more players are fighting for, hitting those caps, but a little bit later in the tournament, right? So those things aren't happening as much as they were earlier in the year, right? But if you look at, once again, Max's performance with this deck, where he's been, hitting the necessary wins and then drawing out, that suddenly starts to look at those numbers that are like the lower win percentages, like, yes, but also look how many draws are on the archetype. And how much those are like, yeah, I get my wins, but I only get as many necessary wins as possible. Whereas I know other players will just play it out no matter what, right?
Yeah. The draws are about I don't know that they're that much bigger than it's pretty much right in line with the rest of the decks in that area. Like Najeela, very similar win percentage, win-loss rate, win-loss draw. Tivit, very similar. Sisay, very similarly proportioned. Sisay has the one advantage, though, where it does have a 2 percentage point or 2.5 better win percentage. So it's just I will break this stuff down in detail in the
I will also say to look at those decks and think about how many of them are decks that are naturally more likely to hit a drawing point in the game than Kinnan is, right?
Exactly.
Kinnan is much faster than those decks. So the fact that it has a comparable amount of draws, I think is indicative to the pattern that I'm talking about, right?
Ryan, what's your number 2 deck?
Blue Farm.
You have Godo at number 1, right?
Of course it is.
God damn it.
Was this even was that even a question? Of course it's number 0. It goes above number 1. Oh, everyone thought they knew what my number 1 was going to be.
You got me, right?
My number 2 is Tim McCrom for all the reasons you just said, basically. There's that. It's great deck, fantastic deck. Bowmasters really just shot it into the stratosphere. I have opinions on Bowmasters, which we'll get into in just a smidge, but Tim McCrom, great deck. We know what it does. We've already talked about it. That's my number 2.
So Tim McCrom is my number 1, and I'm gonna really talk about it here for a second, because there's some really jarringly big stats with this deck that I think is very important to talk about, because it is extraordinarily unique. It is the only deck in the format that had double digits percentage meta share. So it was 14.25% of the meta game in 2023. That is alarmingly large. It had 480 total entries for the year. That is about 200 more than the second place, which is Kinnan. It's just shy, or it's 180 more than Kinnan. That is a lot. Here's the other thing to keep in mind. 122 top 16s for the year. That's 25.5 percentage points just getting into top 16. Then you get into top 4, 43 top 4s. That's a 9% conversion rate. The only deck with a better conversion rate in top 4 is Tevish Crom. The tournament wins this year. 13 fucking tournament wins with a conversion percentage in that tournament percentage of 3%. Again, the only deck that did better than that was Tevish Crom, which had a conversion percentage of 7, which is just, again, we've talked about why that number is different and why there is context behind that. But when you compare it to the other stuff in the format, and you look at the next closest deck, which is Najeela, which is at 2.5 conversion into tournament wins, and then it steeply dropped off at the end of the year. This deck is head and shoulders the best deck in the format, and I don't know that it is particularly close. It is just so much better than everything else. I think really what you said, Ian, is a great way of putting it. Is Bowmasters in the One Ring made this deck the de facto best deck. And I'd like to see a deck that can compete with it. But I mean, overall, like, this is the best deck. It's going to see these amount of numbers. And unfortunately, that means there's not a lot of parity. So, that is a thing.
So, and this is a slight thing to pontificate on a little bit here. Why? Remember what I said? These allow us to ask better questions.
Mm-hmm.
Why is Tymna Kraum the number one?
Mm-hmm.
We say it's the best deck in the format, but that's because the numbers are already showing that it's the best deck, in large part because of just its sheer raw numbers. Why are so many people playing this deck?
Mm-hmm.
And is it because it converts the best? No, Devish Kraum does. So if we're doing on just a winning percentage only, I don't think this is the number one. So why are so many people bringing this deck to the tables? It's hurting its own win percentage because it's showing up in half of a pod.
Here's the actual best take about it is Tymna Kraum is the most consistent deck in the format by like a wide margin. It is going to give you the most consistent decks or results. It is the deck that Joe Nobody from Washington can pick up the deck and have a decent shot of making top 16 just picking up the deck. You can't say that for most decks. Kinnan definitely can, be part in that conversation. But again, like we said, there's a high learning curve with Kinnan. There is a learning curve with Tymna Kraum to some extent, but also when the metagame right now is just draw cards and figure it out, champ. And you're not feeling the pressure to turbo things out, which is not what the metagame is right now. That is a deck that is going to perform very well in that play space. So when you look at that, yes, it does have a lot more entries, but I think even when you look at it proportionally, it still has a 30% win percentage, all of that stuff. And that is with a lot of people playing it and not many decks that, if you look at the other decks that are in this upper echelon of entries, right? They all kind of hover around 25 to 26 in that general area of win percentage. And that is kind of what you would expect when you have that many people playing it, right? It would kind of level itself out. Tymna Kraum doesn't level out at 25. It levels out at 30. And that's huge. So I think that is a huge part of why I think it's the best deck right now.
Yeah. And one of the other things that I would also put in there is I think this is one of the most fun decks for a newer player to play. This makes you feel powerful.
It does. It really does.
It makes you feel like you're cheating. It just every hand's a banger because you can either go for your win, grind the game, cast your commanders. Every hand can do that. Yeah. And just the ability to be able to pivot on so many strategies with one single deck is so powerful. I have seen people in a single game, a single night, take the same deck and go, I'm the turbo player, I'm the mid-range player, and I'm the control player with the exact same deck. And I can't say that about many other decks.
Yeah, no, because I remember I went on record being like, you could probably cut Ad Nauseam from Blue Farm, right?
Yeah.
Which is true. You could. It would just be a slightly worse deck because of that thing that Ryan was talking about, right? I played against a pod in Texas when I was the playing that tournament that I ended up winning with Blue Farm. And I was like, there was a pod with Keurig early on. I was like, Keurig's just going to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And I'm not going to grind all this decks here, right? So I literally just went, sure, I'm going to early vamp for my Nas. And, I went off on top of everyone else. And I was like, the fact that, once again, the pivot potential in that deck is so, it's so huge, right? You're able to just transition to, hey, let's, it's my time. I'm going off now, right? And also, there's nothing as succinct and declarative of I'm going to win the game as a Teferi, a Grand Abolisher, and a Ranger Captain. Yep. There's nothing that says this game is over like those cards. Truly.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, Ian, tell me why Kinnan's the best deck.
Kinnan is goated. No, I mean, I don't know. For part of it's a feeling for me. Part of it's just, so in the realm in which Blue Farm lost all opponents due to the printing of Orcish Bowmasters, Kinnan gained one of the pieces that solely plugged up one of the weaknesses of this deck. And that's the One Ring, right? So the Kinnan's default issue is that it is one of the most board dominant decks potential wise of any other deck, right? Like the ability to convert activations because of your doubled mana, basically 4 mana for a normal deck, like a Thrasios activation can turn into a Nezahal, a Void Winnower, a Tidespout Tyrant, a Hullbreaker Horror, etc. Right? So that conversion is so succinctly powerful in Kinnan on a base level, right? But the weakness of the deck has always been, unless you hit your Nezahal, your Consecrated Sphinx, your Sylvan Library, stuff like that, your hand is therefore empty, right? And you are lower on resources than your opponents, right? So you can have a dominant board state, but your opponent can still jam a Thoracle Consult, and you're like, oh man, I don't got shit for that, right? Because that my Coma doesn't tap down the Thoracle, right? And so you end up in these scenarios that are unfortunate because of that situation, right? Now let's transition to the printing of the One Ring, right? The One Ring is like comically easy for Kinnan to cast, right? 4 mana, the Kinnan is nothing.
That's a turn
like
one.
It is Zilchazada nothing at all, right? So you can easily just be like, turn 1 Mana Vault, turn 2 Kinnan plus One Ring. Like that conversion is comically easy, right? Same thing you can do with like Lotus Petal and Delighted Halfling, right? Or any number of combinations of all of these archetypes, right? The fact that talismans have no downside in Kinnan, you can literally play them and then convert to the exact amount of mana you can play right away. Like is just like one of the craziest upsides of this commander. But anyways, the One Ring specifically, anyways, fills that hole, right? It covers for the potential of, oh, the game's going to shit. Like I can't control the board, et cetera, et cetera. Well, let me actually have this unrevealed information, right? Kinnan is very good at revealing information, dominating the board in a very revealed way. But if your hand is supplemented, then it is so hard to be able to pick it apart, right? Because you can be like, all right, well, I have my removal spell. I'm going to use my odd removal spell to be able to hit this Void Winnower, right? And everyone's like, oh, finally, the Void Winnower is going to go away. And Kinnan's like, yeah, but I got these counter spells because I've been drawing with the One Ring the whole time. You're like, damn, right? Like that's the part where Kinnan feels unsurmountable, right? Is it like a 0.001% thing I have over Blue Farm? Yeah. For me personally, I would feel just a smidge more comfortable playing Kinnan in a tournament because of the little things, like being able to be like, I'm not a Nas deck. There's no point in attacking me. Actually, right? Like comparatively to a Blue Farm or a Rogsai in your pod, right? Little things like that allow you to exist in the game later. The fact that I can not be a problem for a little bit. The fact that I do not have to push to flip into a big creature. The fact that I can be like, I'm going to play a card advantage engine, let you guys do your thing. And you can make demonstrations to the table that say, this is not the problem deck, right? It's a deck that can play well with the rest of the table, right? And as someone who likes going into the late game in this format, I don't want to have a deck that says like, yeah, it's strictly correct to beat the shit out of me at all times, right? Which Blue Farm has. Blue Farm says that all the time, right?
And Rogsai.
And yeah, and Rogsai too. Yeah, absolutely. And so like these very good decks, they have these giant targets on their head that say like, hey, I need you to kick me while I'm down, right? And then there's also the fact that once again, Kinnan is 2 mana. Kinnan is 2 freaking mana, and you recast it for 4, and you recast it for 6, and you recast it for 8 because that's fine. You want to dump a bunch of stupid mana with the deck anyways, right?
Yeah, it always feels like wasted removal when you remove a Kinnan.
It does.
You're like, I'm wasting this card in my hand.
I had the same thing when I was playing Derevi, right? Where I was like, yeah, people were like, yeah, I could kill Derevi right now, but he's going to pay for and put it on the battlefield and untap the mana source he just used to pay for it, so it doesn't matter, right? And like Kinnan feels similar, right, to that sort of inevitability or almost like nihilistic mentality of like, there's no point in doing this right now, right? Like I'm not taking a game action that's helpful. So for all those reasons, Kinnan is exceptionally strong and continues to put up results. And, you know, it has like kind of a flimsy main combo, but like it's a flimsy main combo that's one singular card that needs a few other supplemental cards to convert to a win, right? And then they're super easy to assemble, super easy to 2 to 4 in the colors. And then, yeah, sometimes you're just like, okay, I'll play a Tidespout Tyrant. You're like, yeah, sure, I guess. Like, what am I supposed to do? What do you mean?
Ryan, last but not least, what is your number 1 deck for the year?
Okay, so Go to Bandit Warlord came out in 2018, right? And when Helm of the Host was printed, it was that's actually not my number one. So my number one, at the controversy of everybody, is Najeela, the Blade Blossom.
Ooh.
Everyone else's 7s and 8s is my number one.
Okay.
And the reason that it's number one is all the things that you all said earlier about how Bowmasters really put a hamper on it and stuff like that. None of that has changed. All that stuff is still very, very true. But barring Bowmasters, this deck seems to always be the one that can fight and do just about anything. And it's because of how that commander is built. That commander, you could build a deck that just makes sure there's no creatures on your opponent's boards and just win by itself. It has, I think, there's a certain number of attacks. I always get the number wrong. That just wins the game by itself because of the snowball effect of the warriors.
It's like 6,
now,
isn't it?
It's something like that. It's like 6 unimpeded attacks. The game is over.
Yeah.
You don't need a combo with it. You don't need Derevi or Doer's Repository or whatever it's on nowadays and stuff like. You don't need that. You can do it by itself, and that's insane how powerful that is. Mm-hmm. Now, the whole thing about the Bowmasters is true, but this is my caveat to Bowmasters.
Okay.
Back in 2019, I created the cEDH staples list. We won't go into too deep a subject on that, but basically the long short of it is it's all the things that are considered staple cards for our format. It started from the deck list database. We formulated the thing, and it's been carrying over for years and years and years. Yeah. One of the things that I extrapolated from that when I was curating that list was that the things that people said are going to be staples and they're here forever and they're never going anywhere is not true. People are universally, one, they are horrible about evaluating cards in a vacuum. They're so bad at it. It's like laughably bad how bad it is. Mm-hmm. And I'm not talking about Commander players. I'm talking about cEDH, Commander, and Magic players. I'm talking the whole swath of this entire game. They're notoriously bad for it. And everyone's like, oh my God, Bowmasters, it's the death, it's the this, it's the doom, it's the gloom. It's like, give it a year, maybe give it 2 years, and Bowmasters will be replaced by something else, or the meta will adjust to the point where Bowmasters isn't relevant anymore. Mm-hmm. I say that because, and I have one specific example. Back in the early days, I kept all the historical data from the cEDH deck list database. I'm sorry, the staples list. There was a card that was in almost half of all black decks, and all the way through like August of 2020. So from for 6 or 8 months, it was a card that was in every single black deck. Everyone ran it. Can you guess what it is?
Assassin's
by
Trophy?
The way? It wasn't Assassin's Trophy. It's a good guess though, by the way. It's a creature.
It's a mono black.
It's a mono black creature.
Oh, Confidant?
It's Dark Confidant.
Yeah.
Who plays that?
Boomers.
Exactly. Old heads like me. I think it's really good in Mad Farm.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, this format's like, I mean, at that time we didn't have Fierce Guardianship. And shit,
I know.
Right?
That's what I'm saying. New cards come out. No. Metas shift. It sometimes shift according to those things, which makes things like Bowmasters weaken over time. Bowmasters was printed into a meta with Tymnas everywhere. And, and things like that, which made it so unbelievably powerful. Take away all the creatures, you take away Bowmaster's power. You really do. I mean, pings and wheels and blah, 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 blah. But,
that's absolutely correct, right? Like that's why you see decks like Tivit and Atraxa doing better in general, because they're like, I don't care about my creatures, to be honest. Exactly.
Right? I don't really care about them.
Do you want to pay your ward, the ward cost for every single Bowmaster trigger? Let's fucking go, baby.
But for example, everyone's like, they're blowing their tops at Roaming Throne right now. I'm like, guys, calm down. Roaming Throne is not going to be a cEDH staple. What are you guys thinking?
People actually saying
top blower.
People were saying it was first came out. Yep.
Oh
Roaming Throne, it's going to be in all these decks. It's such a good value piece.
We weren't.
That was a pretty good for that one.
Good,
we were
because
all universally, I guess this is a Magda card.
Yeah. It was just like, what? But everyone's like, oh my God, what? Anyway, I digress. What I'm saying is that when Najeela was doing so strong and when Bowmasters got printed, it was in a heavy Najeela meta. A lot of Najeela decks were out there, and everyone kind of got preemptively scared by it. There was still the Najeela hardcore players that still played through it and stuff like that. But a lot of the people that were just, Najeela's pretty fun. I have it as my second or third deck. They stopped playing it because Bowmasters. It's like when people stop playing Yisan because of Opposition Agent. They just disassembled the deck without even playing through it. And so I think Najeela is still a very, very strong deck. Nothing really changed with the exception of that one card. Yeah. And when that card leaves, Najeela will come back. I still think Najeela is the best one.
I will give you some, I will agree with you on that point to some degree, because it was like, I remember when Op Agent got printed, right? Like there was like this huge thing. It was like, oh, this is going to kill Sisay. It's going to kill all these things. Sisay. Sisay is just not a viable deck with Op Agent. I remember people saying that. And wow, they have egg on their face. And it's just exactly. I do think there is some credence to the idea that, one card can't kill an archetype. Now, I do think some cards can kill an archetype, but Bowmasters, I think to jump off from what you said, I do agree with you. I think that Najeela decks really just need to adjust, and then they'll probably be right back to where they were. I think that's not a particularly hot take, but
yeah, once we see a downtick of Bowmasters, which we will see, by the way, mark the point in this video, that will happen, in another couple years, we will see a downtick of Bowmasters, and we will see that we'll see Najeela come back.
That might be the hot take for me, is that I don't think that card's going
fine.
Anywhere.
That's fine. I didn't say it's going to happen in 6 months. I said it might take a couple years, but it will happen. I'm not saying it'll go away, because there are some cards that never go away.
I think Bowmasters is a card that I think will probably get banned before it just evaporates on its own.
We'll see. I can't predict the future. We'll see. Yeah. Anyway, so Najeela's my number 1. My number 0 is Godo, Bandit Warlord. See, back when 2018, my number 0 when exactly.
I could make this joke. What is it? Ian's number 1 is Belby, or number 0 is Belby.
Belby. I did the other day. I was looking at that and I was like, I did get some new tools, and I was like, no, because they're going to yell at me again. Everyone's going to be like, you're the only one that can win with this deck. The other day, that's the note I got for why that got taken off the database. They were like, I'm pretty sure they're the only person that can win with this deck.
That's like, so funny.
Oh man. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us in doing this year-end power rankings for the 5 of our viewers who are not familiar with playing with power and who you are. Where can people find you and what do you do?
Thank you for having me. We always did the definitive tier list before, and
now we're doing the definitive power rankings.
Exactly. I really love this because this is the natural evolution of it. Because before we were kind of going a little bit more on our own subjective experience and, some gut check feelings and some stuff from the ether out there in the cEDH sphere. But now we have real solid data to really base these things off of. And I think that's such a cool evolution. I think that's so awesome that we have this stuff now. Shout out to all those who made that a reality. Shout out to all the players who participate in these tournaments to make this data a reality, help us formulate these types of things. It's all because of you all that we can do all this. If you want to find me, I'm from a small niche channel called Playing with Power MTG. You can find me wherever there's a search bar. So just type in Playing with Power MTG and I'll probably show up somewhere.
You're not associated with Nintendo, correct?
Patent pending. Patent pending.
Well, Ryan, I really appreciate you joining us on the podcast. It is always my favorite time of year when I get to have you on. Because it is just I love doing these videos. I think they're so fun, and getting to have you on to do the new iteration of them, I think is super fun. And I'm gonna say fun one more time just for fun. Ian, where can people find you? What are you up to these days? We're gonna be at Cincinnati this week.
So am I. Awesome.
Oh, hey, sweet. Hello, I am Ian, the other half of this podcast, and I also do my own thing. Wow, I'm such a diverse person.
Is there a cue card in front of you? Why did you read it like that?
I almost always do.
Ian always does this as awkwardly as humanly possible.
Hi, my name is Ian.
I'm pretty sure the AI like voice spot that I have at the beginning of the episode reads with more inflection than Ian does.
Hello, I am from the YouTube channel. And,
from the YouTube channel, playing
My
with
Rufflecopter
power.
goes squash, squash.
Sorry, we'll stop interrupting your plug. I apologize.
Yeah, hi everybody. If you don't know who I am, you're one of the two people who thinks Cal doesn't like Tivit. But feel free to check me over at ComedIan MTG on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter and Discord, all of those places. I got a fun little Discord folks to go in. Honestly, I'm so proud of the fact that the ComedIan MTG Discord often functions very well without me. It is quite funny at this point. But yeah, I am a cEDH tournament grinder and coach, a co-host of the Mind Sculptors here, and have my own channel where I break down a lot of the tournament stuff that Cal will be talking about. So. Yeah. You know, basically all of the information that you hear as we summarize it in raw facts and figures, I take a microscope to each tournament, talk about the deck list, the things that do well. Apparently I missed last week when someone played Francisco Thrasios and wasn't even playing Thoracle Consult. And I saw that comment. But yeah, all those things and stuff. I have quite a few W's to my name and pretty good record going for the past couple of years. So if you're interested in cEDH coaching, which is something I do as a full-time career, you can also find me at any of those places, comedianmtg@gmail.com. You can find me on Discord, Twitter. My DMs are open. So feel free to hit me up and all that stuff.
It's amazing. So I think we need to start the new year off right. And the way that I want to start it off right is by I don't know. Ian, what do you think we should do to start the year off right?
So on the count of three, we'll go do something that really indicates the start of this next year, or some may call it next challenge, like a challenge to become immune to the hardships of next year, almost like an immunity challenge. So for my good friend Jeff Propex here, I'll say, survivors, are you ready? Begin.
This is the Mind Sculptors podcast. I'm Cal.
I'm Ian. That's Jeff Probst.
We'll see you next week.
Bye.